Welcome back to Playful Whimsies. Today I have for you a Mrs. Piggle-Wiggle book called Mrs. Piggle-Wiggle's Magic. Again, this is by Betty MacDonald and pictures by Hilary Knight. And here are the first couple of pictures. Dedication to my mother, Sydney Bard, the one most often interrupted, the faithful laughter at the thought you said, the patient corrector of the bad table manners, the rapt listener to the long, dull dreams and movie plots, the fairest receiver of tattletales, an eager participant in all the time-worn riddles and tricks. I humbly dedicate this book. And you can see here the different chapters. So we are going to start with Mrs. Piggle-Wiggle's Magic. And let's begin. Of course, the reason that all the children in our town like Mrs. Piggle-Wiggle is because Mrs. Piggle-Wiggle likes them. Mrs. Piggle-Wiggle likes children. She enjoys talking to them. And best of all, they do not irritate her. When Molly O'Toole was looking at the colored pictures in Mrs. Piggle-Wiggle's big dictionary and just happened to be eating a candy cane at the same time and drooled candy cane juice on the colored pictures of Jim's and then forgot and shut the book so the pages all stuck together, Miss Piggle-Wiggle didn't say, "Such a careless little girl can never ever look at the colored pictures in my big dictionary again." Nor did she say, "You must never look at books when you are eating." She said, "Let's see. I think we can steam those pages apart and then we can wipe the stickiness off with a little soap and water, like this. Now see, it's good as new. There's nothing as cozy as a piece of candy and a book. Don't look so embarrassed, Molly. I almost drool every time I look at those gems. Which one is your favorite? I think mine is the lapis lazuli." When Dick Williams, who was showing off for Patsy by riding his wagon with his eyes shut, crashed through Mrs. Piggle-Wiggle's basement window and landed in the coal bin, Mrs. Piggle-Wiggle laughed so much that she had to sit down on the front steps and wipe her eyes with her apron. Dickie was awfully scared and was going to sneak out the basement door and go home, but Mrs. Piggle-Wiggle, still laughing, leaned through the broken window and said, "Hand me the putty knife and that can of putty off the shelf, then go get me that pane of glass leaning against the wall over there by the furnace. Thank you very much. Now watch carefully, Dickie, because putting in a window glass is something that every boy should know how to do, especially boys who ride wagons with their eyes closed." When Marilyn Matson, who was helping Mrs. Piggle-Wiggle serve tea, dropped and broke her brown teapot, she said, "Well, that's the luckiest thing I've ever known. You didn't get a drop of hot tea on you when you broke that nasty teapot with the leaky spout that I've hated for 15 years. Tomorrow I'll go to town and buy a new one. I think I'll get pink, and I'm going to test the spout before I buy it." "What about the tea?" said Marilyn, wiping her tears on her sleeve. "Make it in the coffee pot," said Mrs. Piggle-Wiggle, "and we'll call it toffee." Very funny, because toffee is a type of candy that tastes like coffee. And I think caramel it has a caramely taste to it too. Another nice thing about Mrs. Piggle-Wiggle, when a child makes her a present, no matter how splotchy or crooked it might be, she uses it and keeps it where everyone can see it. John Wilfred made her a vase out of a meat sauce bottle with such a little neck that only flowers with stems like hairs would fit in it. Not only that, but he painted it a sort of bilious green, and the paint was too thick and ran down the sides in warty lumps. But Mrs. Piggle-Wiggle loves Johnny, and she loves the warty vase because Johnny made it for her. And she keeps it on the windowsill above the sink with at least one flower gasping for breath jammed through its little neck. Every time Johnny comes into her kitchen, he points proudly to the vase and says, "Do you see that pretty vase over there on the windowsill? I made it for Mrs. Piggle-Wiggle, didn't I, Mrs. Piggle-Wiggle?" When Susan Gray came staggering over with a plate of the first cookie she had ever made for Mrs. Piggle-Wiggle, Mrs. Piggle-Wiggle didn't take one look at the tannish gray lumps and say, "No, thank you." She said, "Why, Susan, you smart girl, 8 years old and already making cookies. You're going to make somebody a very fine wife." "Yeah, somebody with good teeth," said Herbert Prentice, who had taken one of the gray lumps and had found that trying to eat it was like biting on a stone. Mrs. Piggle-Wiggle took the cookie away from him and said, "Oh, Herbert, these are special cookies. You dip them in hot tea and then take a bite." She hurried to the kitchen and made some tea, and then she and Molly and Herbert and Susan sat at the kitchen table and drank tea and gnawed at the stony cookies, which, in addition to being hard as rocks, tasted like glue because Susan had put in gravy coloring instead of vanilla. When Molly and Herbert made gagging motions at each other, Mrs. Piggle-Wiggle slipped them some ginger cookies under the table, and Susan was so proud that she didn't even notice. Julie Ward knitted Mrs. Piggle-Wiggle a scarf that was about 10 yards long and 2 inches wide. And when Mrs. Piggle-Wiggle opened the box, she didn't say, "My, Julie, you must have had a giraffe in mind when you made this scarf." Instead, she said, "You know, Julie, this is a much too pretty to wear as a scarf and keep tucked inside my coat. I'm going to wear it as a sash." She took the long, dirty, blue, wormy-looking scarf and wrapped it around and around her waist and looped the ends over it. And it did look nice from a distance. Julie was so proud. She said, "You know, Mrs. Piggle-Wiggle, when I was making that scarf, I thought to myself, now I'll just make this a bit longer, and then Mrs. Piggle-Wiggle can wear it as a belt too." Of course, she hadn't really. What actually had happened was that she knitted on this scarf every afternoon when she listened to the radio, and she just forgot to stop. And I have to say, as somebody who knits and crochets, it's kind of hard to judge somebody's size without having them there. It's very difficult to make a surprise gift. Another wonderful trait of Mrs. Piggle-Wiggle's is the interested way she listens to dreams. Now, every child in the world loves to tell what he dreams, and if the dream doesn't seem quite long enough or interesting enough, sometimes children work in old movies they have seen or stories their daddies have read to them the night before. Dream telling is an innocent pastime and very good for the imagination. But unfortunately, dream telling usually occurs at breakfast, a time when daddies and mothers are slightly irritable and always in a hurry and in no mood for long drawn out stories of and then I was riding on this elephant, and two Indians came up and tried to shoot me. But then, I turned into a walnut and dropped to the ground. And, this about this time, mothers say, just let the dream go and finish your cereal. Or brother and sister will say, oh, now you're just making that up. And, anyways, it's my turn. Now, I dreamed. Mrs. Piggle-Wiggle not only listens to dreams, she asks about them. Right after school, when the children come over to dig for treasure in her backyard, Mr. Piggle-Wiggle was a pirate and he died. And when he died, he buried his treasure in his backyard. Or to have tea or play dolls, she'll say, anybody have any good dreams last night? And they'll be off. Once Molly O'Toole dreamed she was a raisin and was eaten by a rat. Johnny Green dreamed he was a pirate and lived in a whale. Herbert Pintus dreamed that he was an icicle and could freeze anyone he touched. Susan Gray dreamed that her dolls all came alive. Larry Gray dreamed he was a cowboy and had a white horse. Mary Lou Robertson dreamed that her covers were frosting and woke up with her mouth full of blankets. Katie Wheeling dreamed that she was was a movie star and had a real fur coat. Patsy said that she had dreamed that she was an electric toaster, and everybody said she was making it up. And Patsy cried, and Mrs. Piggle-Wiggle said she would help Patsy with her dreams. Some of the other children's dreams are so long and dull and full of ra, ras that Mrs. Piggle-Wiggle finishes them off for them and says, that was the way it was, wasn't it, Poppy? Much to their evident relief. So you can see that loving children the way she does, Mrs. Piggle-Wiggle just naturally understands them even when they are being difficult, which is, of course, why all the mothers in our town call Mrs. Piggle-Wiggle whenever they are having trouble with their children. Mrs. Piggle-Wiggle always knows what to do. And then, of course, she has a big cupboard full of magic powders and pills and appliances to help cure children's bad habits. And that concludes chapter 1. The next chapter we're going to do of Mrs. Piggle-Wiggle a week from Wednesday. The Thought You Setter's Cure. And you're going to enjoy it so much. I hope you have a beautiful day, and thank you for joining me. Bye.